Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's, the sixth in the series of speaking out about history. We welcome Willard Sterne Randall, the author of the book, The Founder's Fortunes. After a successful 17-year career as a feature writer for the Philadelphia Bulletin, magazine writer for the Philadelphia Inquirer, an investigative journalist for Philadelphia Magazine, and a stringer for the Times Life news service, Willard pursued advanced studies in history at Princeton University. A biographer of Benjamin and William Franklin, Benedict Arnold, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and Ethan Allen, he has co-authored collections of biographies and ebooks with his wife, the biographer and award-winning poet, Nancy Nara. As a journalist, Randall won the National Magazine Award for Public Service from Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, the Standard Gravure Award, the Hillman Prize, the Loeb Award, and the John Hancock Prize. His Benedict Arnold biography received 4 national awards and was a New York Times notable book. Publishers Weekly chose his biography of Jefferson as one of the 10 best biographies of 1993. He received the Award of Merit from the American Revolution Roundtable in 2019. He won the Thomas Fleming Award for Outstanding Military History. He taught American history at John Cabot University in Rome and at the University of Vermont and Champlain College, where he was a distinguished scholar in history and is a professor emeritus. He is a contributing editor to the Quarterly Journal of Military History, or MHQ. He lives, writes, teaches, and lectures, and likes to swim in Burlington, Vermont. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to present Willard Sterne Randall.
Thank you very much, Brooks. And it's my pleasure to be able to talk about this new book to such a wonderful membership. I set out to write this book because I got a little tired of hearing on the news what a terrible time this was, how divided the country was, how corrupt the electoral process was, how cutthroat congressional relations were, et cetera. And it reminded me what I was hearing of something that I'd read a long time ago, and that was the period just before World War I, when you had people described as the robber barons, great inequality of wealth, violent unionizing, where the federal troops were used to break up crowds, where young women were locked in a factory and couldn't get out rather than let them sign union cards. And so they wound up burning to death in the famous Triangle Fire, which happened to be right at press row where cameras for the first time could show that kind of thing to the public. So the media has been involved in the news ever since that time. So I thought, in a way, I was comparing that time of upheaval, where you had the majority party, the Republican Party, split, Teddy Roosevelt and this bull moose. You had every election, the socialists, Eugene V. Debs, getting more and more of the vote. So there were a lot of parallels. And one thing that struck me that most people don't know about at that time was the progressive era, as it is called, in journalism began 1913. With a historian at Columbia University, Charles Beard, in which he toppled the founding fathers from their pedestals and then went through their pockets and, oh horrors, found bonds and notes. And from that, he drew his famous hypothesis that basically said the founding fathers were in it for themselves, that they were in it for the money. And that hypothesis really, I think, warped education at the highest level for a long time. We began to look at the dark side of everything. And it made no sense to me that the founding fathers all of a sudden had become so evil. I had been brought up, as I'm sure you were too, with something short of adulation for George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. They were our heroes, our founders, and all of a sudden these were greedy, self-serving bums. So I thought I ought to examine that hypothesis very closely, and not just go on accepting it. And what I found out from my 5 years of work that I've put in on this was that they weren't self-serving as a whole. At the Constitutional Convention, for example, there were 55 delegates. One of them had exactly $10 worth of Revolutionary War notes. And after the new Constitution came in and ushered in Hamilton's Bank of the United States, et cetera, and all the speculation supposedly bore fruit, his $10 had grown to $12 in 4 years. And so I thought, I'm going to look at all these. And I have the privilege of being able to do research that Charles Beard couldn't do. He had very fragmentary state records. The federal government had not spent a great deal of money as it did in the 1960s and 70s, publishing the various state papers, naval documents of the Revolution, universities like Princeton spending more time on Jefferson's letters than he did, et cetera, et cetera. But I thought I would capitalize on the modern research and challenge that hypothesis. And in the process, I got to focus on a half a dozen of the founders, especially Benjamin Franklin, the world's favorite American, to the extent that when Miranda wrote his Hamilton play and Broadway hit and had a song in it about Hamilton, he decided to take it out because he said, if anything Franklin is in, he takes it over. It overshadows everything. So you've got Hamilton's Broadway play with no Benjamin Franklin. And Franklin, to me, was fascinating because his rise from, he was one of 10 sons. He one of 17 children of a candle maker. And when he was all through, he could have dinner with the kings of England and France. Well, not England so much, but he could become an English gentleman with a coat of arms on his carriage and a beautiful wig and fancy clothes. And he wasn't masquerading. It was possible for him in one lifetime to rise from absolute poverty, a runaway kid who spent his last $2 on loaves of bread. We know that because Franklin told us his life story. So I also had to examine what Franklin said and what he did. I didn't find any dissidence, is that Franklin focused on his early life. And so I've been able to come up with, I think, some fascinating details on his later life, especially devoted time to William Franklin, his illegitimate son. And I wrote about the two of them in a book called A Little Revenge, Benjamin Franklin and his son. And without looking at the son, you don't see what Benjamin Franklin lost in the American Revolution. So on to Washington, another rags to riches story, raised, we would say today, by a single mom, widowed 3 times, very possessive, very angry at her son when he rode her pet horse and rode it until it fell and died. Washington, who learned how, he never really had a schooling, but he learned surveying to the point that he had the trigonometry skills, not only to survey 50,000 acres of land himself, but for artillery fire in the Revolutionary War. And to see how he grew and how his good fortune grew. He was a very lucky man, although he was a very uneven general. But when he lost, people admired him for his courage. When he lost big, they promoted him and gave him an expense account. So he was a fascinating figure. He couldn't afford to be president. He couldn't afford not to be president because he said, unless I take this office, I don't want it. But if I don't take it, I can't afford to live in retirement. So again, there were so many touchstones with modern times. Robert Morris, the man behind, he's Oz behind the revolution. He was the man with the creative genius to make money where there was no money. And such fascinating things. He actually paid off Washington's troops so they could go home and not create a mutiny by writing 6,000 handwritten notes in one weekend, drawing on his whole fortune, only to wind up himself in debtor's prison. So I found so many new stories here that I thought I would put them together in this collective narrative.
All right. Well, thank you. I've got to say, I really enjoyed the book, and it is a look at an aspect of the revolution and our founding history that few people really have a good understanding of. So it's something that's long been needed, and it fills in a lot of the, as Paul Harvey used to say, a lot of the rest of the story about how we got to where we are. The basis of this series has to do with our membership, the compatriots of the SAR, submitting their questions for the authors of the different books we're featuring. So we're going to get into the list of submitted questions. First up is a question from Mark Anthony of the Georgia Society. And Mark asks that given the many founding fathers utilized their personal fortunes to fund military units or to finance supplies, how is this comparable to the current policy of using economic sanctions against both enemy governments and individuals?
I would offer two answers. First, from the very beginning of our history, which is before the revolution, Americans, especially merchants and planters, grouped together in what they called associations to apply economic sanctions on England. Boycott imports, boycott taxes. They got the Stamp Act reversed, which was an excise tax that had been functioning in England for 3/4 of a century, but they got it thrown out. And they learned from that by organizing, they could then act as if they were a national entity and without bloodshed go toe-to-toe with the British, because the British were afraid of losing thousands of jobs and hundreds of merchants tanking. And also because Parliament was invested heavily in the economy. So if you boycotted the economy, you were directly sanctioning the members of Parliament. No better example than the Tea Party, where the shares in the East India Tea Company were owned by members of Parliament. So when they made a policy of trying to force the tea down American throats, the Americans could respond with sanctions of their own, which led to the Boston Tea Party and the revolution. So we have used sanctions from the beginning, and George Washington favored using sanctions instead of war. He held out against civil war because his family back in England had suffered terribly in a civil war. Only when the British attacked us did Washington think it was justified to go to war, but he believed in sanctions.
All right, thank you. Next question is from Michael Martin of the Alabama Society. And Michael's question is, what do you think our founding fathers would think about the recent controversy surrounding our personal finances as relate to our government officials? For example, government officials not wishing to release personal business financial documents, current move to prohibit government officials from using knowledge obtained from positions for stock purchases, and to influence personal business interests.
Again, I'd have to answer two questions in that one question. First of all, from the outset, the Continental Congresses agreed on unanimity. There would be no factions, there would no personal attacks, and there would be no correspondence out of Congress, which of course John Adams famously ignored in his letters to Abigail. But it was very, very quiet because they wanted to keep this aura of absolute agreement. All the votes were recorded as affirmative, or that they were negative, but nobody was identified. This lasted about 1 year. And that was when we sent our first diplomat to France, Silas Deane of Connecticut, who already was distrusted by half the people in Connecticut, so he wasn't reelected to the Continental Congress. But he knew a lot about trade. And so he was sent to arrange a trade treaty to get weapons, provisions, and money from France, even before Franco went over. Unfortunately, he ran into ignorance about European customs, as most Americans had at the time. And when he came home just on leave, he thought on leave, the King of France gave him a going away present, which he did with all departing diplomats, and that was a snuff box with his image on it, with some diamonds. Well, when Silas Deane got back to Congress, I think that led immediately to the first congressional audit of one of its delegates, Silas Deane. And he was caught blindsided. All his records were back in Paris. He couldn't get a hearing for months. And when he finally got back to England, he learned to his horror that his assistant in the embassy there was actually a British spy who had taken all his records and let the British capture all his ships and investments. So Silas Deane was the first one accused of peculation, and he would die in poverty in Europe. So that's Silas Deane. George Washington was always suspicious of Robert Morris because George Washington understood the realm of the plantation and the businesses that came from that. But he didn't understand the secret nature and the alliances of international trade, which were pretty secret because the British did not allow it. But Robert Morris was the master of it. And he also knew to bargain crops for guns. The secret of how we got weapons was Congress immediately opened our ports and said certain things could be traded to any foreign country that wanted to help us. So that's why we had French aid. So Robert Morris was a genius, but like many geniuses, very private about how he had earned his money. Nobody ever investigated him. And when it was over, he was the only one who could figure out how to pull the whole thing together financially. So there was suspicion, but they were afraid that if they looked too closely at each other, the alliance might fracture and fall apart. So they kept their suspicions pretty much to themselves unless they left Congress or like some joined the Loyalists and joined the British.
I know with Silas Deane and both Morris and then later on Alexander Hamilton, that there was a lot of jealousy and envy among some members of Congress over things that they don't understand or didn't understand. So if it wasn't something they were familiar with or they were comfortable with, then they assumed there was some unnatural machinations going on. So they would tend to look down upon those people or cast aspersions on their character or their patriotism.
Some things never change.
That's very true. All right, our next question is from Dr. John Turley, West Virginia Society. And John says, it seems that George Washington was not only first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen, but he was also first in business. From land speculation to canal building to tobacco production to milling to freshwater fisheries to distilling. Did any other founding father have as many varied interests?
I can give you the shortest answer there, but I won't leave it at that. Nobody came close to George Washington. And diversification, it was a new idea, didn't even have a word for it yet. But he was the one who analyzed the tobacco trade and its relationship with England and decided that 75% of his profits were going to middlemen, to agents, to customs, etc. And he switched crops. We would say he changed his business model to wheat, which he could sell to his neighbors, which he could grow without so many slaves, so much intense backbreaking work. And then while he was looking around from his front porch, he noticed an awful lot of fish in the Potomac. So he built ships and took advantage of the annual shad runs, began to prepare fish. And he was provisioning the islands in the Caribbean that could not grow the things that he could. He eventually was trading as far away as Italy before the revolution began. So he's really the first modern businessman of them all. And he was the one that was so respected, I think, not just because of his military achievements, which were non-existent by that time. He had a series of blunders or things that he couldn't help, but he had no great victory. He had a great image because he looked beautiful in a uniform, but he was admired because he was a skilled, successful, low-key businessman. John Hancock comes close We know so little about him. It's a shame. He's been reduced to a signature on a document, and he's part of the language now. When I got my new contract, I had to sign my John Hancock to it. But he also had the idea of not being married to one product or one line of business. So when he inherited his uncle's business, he built the ships that took the whale oil from Nantucket to England. Then he sold the ships and the oil, bought a new ship, filled it with consumer goods, brought back all the things that Americans were not allowed to make because of the ever more restrictive British trade laws. So he took advantage of that. So he went from whaling. He set up a chain of stores to sell the products that he was bringing back from England. He put his clerks to work as managers, and he gave them the money to buy the businesses. When there was unemployment or anything wrong economically, he supported the workers and their families. He was the most popular population in Boston, with all due respect to the Addams family. So he comes close. He also built the first resort in Boston. He didn't get to spend any time in it. He put his shipbuilders to busy building buildings. So I'd say he comes close to Washington.
Thank you. That's some interesting insight there. Next up is a question next two actually, from the SAR Outreach Education crew. In the Founder's Fortune, you often give monetary figures from the 18th century and equivalents for how much money that would equal today. What sources did you consult to determine the value in today's dollars?
Well, first of all, I got very frustrated writing my earlier books because I could find out how much somebody was paid in 1776 in pounds sterling, but I couldn't find out what that represented today. How much really was that? School teacher got 15 pounds sterling. Yes, he wasn't going to live on $15 today. He couldn't convert to, but fortunately I have a son-in-law who's the senior economics editor at Princeton University Press, who clued me in about what economists used and economic scholars. It's a website called Measuring Worth. I highly recommend it. And it's prepared by economic historians at the University of Chicago, et cetera. And there's a long essay that goes with it you can study. You can't just take one number. What I use is what you could buy then and what you could buy now and how much that is. Now, that is not the same thing as the consumer price index, which is deflationary. So what you have to do is look at the date, and there are windows you plug in the numbers, the date when the transaction took place, the amount of the currency or the money then, the date now, and then convert it into today's money. So what we get is some surprises. A lot of the revolution was because the British thought we were living lavishly after they'd gone horribly into debt in the French and Indian Wars. But when you do the math and you see what the real cost was and what they call opportunity costs, the British came out of the French and Indian Wars with a $10 trillion debt. And they thought the Americans were getting away with something who had benefited from it and weren't paying anything. So the tension was there that for the first time explained to me how they would go head to head so early.
Well, and I know one of the points in the Townsend Duties and some of the others of that trying to eliminate the debt by taxing the colonies to get back some of the money they invested in our defense is that we were equally in debt and suffered through an inflationary period following the war in the colonies. That we
Absolutely.
We were not avoiding taxes, we were applying our own taxes to our own people.
And that's the point that from the American side, we the colonies were chartered by the king. We were supposed to raise our own domestic taxes to pay our own militia, which the Penn family refused to do. So Benjamin Franklin organized his own militia, for example, to pay for roads, bridges, upkeep, barracks for British troops, etc. So we were already paying all that, and through our own elective legislatures, already a big step away from England. But at the same time, Benjamin Franklin was the only one with the wisdom, I think, and to get the right ear of a general and say, you know, what you won in the French and Indian War was a monopoly of all of our trade, all of our custom. That's what you won. And you want to charge us taxes on top of that.
Exactly. Next question. Many of the monetary transactions the founders participated in during the American Revolution would today be considered conflicts of interest. What was the 18th century equivalent of today's conflict of interest statements?
Well, there's a term historians use called presentism, that we should beware what they call the sin of presentism, that we judge the past according to our own ethos, our own reading of events and history. So conflict of interest to me really doesn't emerge very much as a term until the third of the 20th century. Then it's thrown around because politicians are making money on the side, or they have relatives getting contracts for things with government money without declaring it. So it became something that became a political weapon in politics. At the same time, you did have something like, you did have and here's how I think of it, what we would call conflicts of interest, not what they would. For example, Silas Deane and Robert Morris were part of Congress. They were part of the Secret Committee on Trade. And at the same time, they were business partners. Robert Morris backed Silas Deane when he went to France. Silas Deane, while he was over there, arranged shipments. And what Congress approved, not disapproved, Congress approved was a 5% commission, like a carrying charge, for anything Robert Morris or his partners transported one way or the other. And so it was approved by Congress. It's hardly a conflict of interest, but we would really frown on that. If we found out that some member of the cabinet was using a government plane to carry out business of his own. And we not only frown on it, we expose it. We frown on it and try to get rid of that person. So we have changed, but they didn't see it as a conflict, saw it as how they helped each other. And as Robert Morris wrote to Silas Deane, if this helps the government, there's nothing wrong in us helping ourselves to a small percentage of it.
And that seems absolutely fair, considering the way the monarchy worked and the way the members of the House of Lords who were serving, who were also renting property, they were making money from various other means associated with their position. So it seems it would have been almost a common practice across the board.
Yes.
All right. Next up, Steve Perkins of the Missouri Society. And Steve asks, what are the author's insights into the financial schemes usually involving land in New England preceding the American Revolution? Such schemes created an oligarchy of sorts, class divide, and in some cases, crippling debt that passed to another generation of debtors' children. Why would we look at today's financial stratification differently?
Well, I can speak for Vermont, shall we say, where I'm sitting for this interview, which had two hereditary families of trying to make money on the land. First, the family of Benning Wentworth of New Hampshire, the royal governor, and his relatives, who I figured out made about $3 million our money in just the fees to allow settlers to set up town charters. Everything that was done. Royal governors were paid small salaries, but they got paid for every marriage license, every document, every deed, and all land sales. So Wentworth and his family basically divided what we now call Vermont. It was called the New Hampshire Grants. And they sold off parcels of it, 251 of them, right after the French and Indian War. And they sold a lot of it to a company whose chief organizer was Ethan Allen. And Ethan Allen then set up a dynasty for the Allen family that in one way or another, first in land, but then in political influence, reaches right down to our own time. So the Wentworths were out with the Revolution and the Allens were in. But I can't think of any better example, maybe better than that, was the Lees. The Lees in Virginia, the Lees were going west, the Lees in every major land. And there were 9 land companies vying for lands from the British who had investors in the Continental Congress. I mean, the United States as it is, and England at the time were what I think it was Benjamin Franklin said, land mad. There was land madness. Take the old French Empire, whack it up, invest in it. And Washington wanted the Mississippi Valley. He was not shy. He got to know Richard Henry Lee through that association. The Lees had plenty of land and money back in Virginia, but it was the passion of the time, what to do with all that land, and without consulting the people who lived on it, of course. Who, by the way, had no rights under the crown because the crown did not believe that Indians could be citizens because they had no fixed address. No fixed address. If they didn't know where their home was, how could they claim it? Well, the fact is that was ignorance. The Indians knew whose land it was and whose shouldn't be on it, and knew exactly where their quarters should be. But it was shove the Indians aside, take the French lands, and divide it. And the Franklins organized a land company. They wanted to be a dynasty. They had a land company with very high crown officials as stockholders that only failed because the revolution came along.
Well, I know in between the royal colonies and the proprietary colonies that there were land companies or the equivalent in each of them. And I know
Yes.
Dunmore in Virginia, and Dunmore's War was sort of related to that whole Ohio Land Company and the dispute between Pennsylvania and Virginia. So that kind of permeated the entire Western Expansion Initiative, and the 1763 demarcation line or settlement line certainly put a cramp into a lot of the initiative or money-making possibilities for our founders there.
And I think it was one of the major causes of the revolution. It hasn't been given enough a study. I think people like Washington. Washington believed that he was going to be getting land grants from the crown for his military service. And just before he rode off to Cambridge as commander-in-chief, he met with Dunmore one more time and said, come on, am I going to get that grant from King George's War? He hadn't gotten that yet. And when he didn't, it had to be something that he had in his mind, that they had been ripped off by this dividing line, which would pretty much run through my house, by the way. Western Vermont would be illegal.
My ancestor in Virginia was just on the eastern edge of that line down in Henry County, Virginia.
Right.
So it impacted a lot of people. All right. Well, that's an interesting answer. That's illuminating there. Our next question is from Henry Stobbs of the Ohio Society. And he says, some historical Marxist critics of the American Revolution have posited that members of the landed and moneyed classes profited from the chaos of the conflict at the expense of labor, both free and unfree. This seems wrong to me, but is the argument a valid one?
Well, first of all, it's a shaky premise because it's based on Marxist class analysis. And you first would have to establish a class, just as anybody suing before the Supreme Court has to establish that they have a right to sue, that they have status. There was no class. It was so fluid. How can you say there could be a class that had Patrick Henry, Benjamin Franklin, just any number of people who's started poor, had some money, then it collapsed. I mean, there was too much social slippage and financial slippage to ever categorize them as a class, something that has cohesion and lasts. So it doesn't work as class analysis. Society was much too fluid. There were varieties of levels of wealth. The Hudson River aristocracy. You could almost say that the intermarriages in the Hudson Valley designated a class. If you just looked at the Livingston families and Schuyler and a few others. But then if you look at the tens of thousands of new immigrants who were there, many of them in worse condition than they had been as renters of the landlords in Scotland, and saw that some of them could rise to become royal officials in one lifetime, and then sit in the Continental Congress, and then become district court judges in the new republic. How is that a class? A class is something you're pretty much locked into. So I say his class analysis doesn't work. And a further example of it, when you look at the Constitutional Convention, there are 55 delegates of varying levels of wealth, education, sophistication. So you have somebody who was a storekeeper in New Hampshire, and his first paid job was as a delegate to Congress. Then you have Robert Morris, the first American billionaire. I've got an argument whether he was a billionaire or not, but he was, depending on how the French categorized him and how he lined up with other Americans. So he was not wealthy, and he wound up with 3 miserable years in a debtor's prison. If he were part of a class, that could never have happened. And he saved Washington's army. And here's how the whole class thing becomes foolish. Robert Morris is sitting in debtor's prison. George Washington comes to visit him in prison. Robert Morris insists on buying lunch. He has to pay the jailer for the lunch, to give lunch to, and George Washington not only didn't refuse it, he wanted people to know how much this man had helped him, and how yet he didn't have the money or the influence to get Robert Morris out of jail, because there were no bankruptcy courts yet. Robert Morris went through bankruptcy, and when it was all over, what did Robert Morris gain? What he gained basically was, in his own words, "I'm a free citizen of the United States of America," which to me blows away the whole Beard thing. That's what they were fighting for. They wanted to be free. They wanted to be citizens of this new country. And it took all of them. There were no classes involved.
And I enjoyed the title of that chapter, "The Best Room in the House," I believe was alluding to Morris bribed or asked the jailer to provide the best room where they were so he could entertain Washington. Okay, next question is from Larry Josephowski of the Delaware Society. And Larry asks, the founding fathers were, as a group, a fairly well-off group of individuals. Looking at how they did after the war, who foresaw the changes and benefited the most from independence?
Well, it's the same problem. They were not fairly well off. That sounds very, group is not too far from class. Some of them had a fair amount of money. Some of them had no money except for their government jobs. And that's a fascinating aspect, because the country was made up of individual states under the Confederation, and would remain so under the new Constitution. And each state, as we are famously reminded now, could set up its own electoral laws, including its qualifications for office. So you had very uneven qualifications for office. In South Carolina, it takes something like 10,000 pounds sterling of property to qualify to be the governor. And it was a very high bar for, and it was your qualification for voting or standing for election was developed land in the agrarian states, South. In New England, however, in Massachusetts, your right to vote was on 50 pounds or the equivalent of 50 pounds of property, but a carpenter could claim his tools as property and qualify. Somebody who owned a shop could claim inventory. Someone who owned a house could claim the value of that house. So you had a much wider range of wealth at different levels in New England. The Chief Justice of New Jersey had no money whatsoever. So you were getting a group of experienced government officials, and that's most of the people who came to the Constitutional Convention, not because they had wealth. So what did they expect to gain? Well, whatever they expected, not all of them got it. I mean, not only do you have Robert Morris tanking and losing everything and winding up in debtor's prison, but he had 3 signers of the Declaration of Independence winding up in debtor's prison. You had quite a few who lost their money. Many of them were in there for idealism or absolute fury at being treated as second-class Englishmen. So to me, it doesn't equate to what they thought they would get out of it. What they sought and what they got were 2 different things.
All right, thank you. Our next question is from Dr. Stephen Quay of the International Society. As Stephen asks you to compare and contrast the asset classes of today's wealthy to those of the Revolutionary War. I know the corporate structures and shares per se was a new concept in 1600, when my ancestor purchased shares in the Jamestown Company to help launch that trip to the Americas. But what about in the Revolutionary War era? Now, greater than 95% of wealth is in the equity class, but maybe during that period, it was in land ownership or whole business without public market ownership.
I think you could just flip those numbers. I think you had 95% of the country feeding 5%. The other 5% who didn't have to grow their own crops or barter for things. The gentleman's point is right about Jamestown, of course. That was something new called a joint stock company, ushered in under King James I. But these were wealthy men in England who were buying shares in a venture, and then it was their generation of venture capitalists, but they didn't intend to go and take up residence in the land. I know of only one English lord before the Revolution who actually came to live in America, but they were investing, many of them, to give some opportunities to their second and third sons, who did not stand to inherit anything under the primogeniture laws of England. So you had a lot of young noblemen who, by the way, didn't want to work too hard, and took John Smith to teach them to stay up long enough and use a pick and shovel. And also there were, one of the things that has been left out of our history of the Revolution, the number one grievance in the Declaration of Independence as laid out by Thomas Jefferson is that we are not allowed to have any banks or currency. So there was no opportunity to invest in banks. There were no corporations. There were businesses, but they would take in partners. There was nothing like a stock market, no public marketing of ownership. That would come along, and Robert Morris really started that by setting up the first bank, which was the Pennsylvania Bank. And then that morphed into the Bank of North America, and Hamilton, his Bank of New York. But there were not opportunities for that kind of investment before the Revolution. Land could be parceled out, and there was the Connecticut, the Susquehanna Company of Connecticut, for example, one of those companies that had stockholders to open up new land. Of course, Connecticut's idea was to annex half of Pennsylvania. So Ethan Allen's father was a shareholder in that. But other than that kind of investment in a dream of wealth in those land speculations, there were very few opportunities.
All right, thank you. Next question, also from the International Society, is from Bryce Terry. And he says, William Franklin comes across as a very interesting personality with distinguished service to the colonies over a long period of time. To say his relationship with his much more famous father was complex would be an understatement. What should we know about William Franklin, and what did you learn about him in your research that you did not know previously?
Well, actually, I cut my teeth as a biographer on William Franklin, because when I was a journalist in Philadelphia, I covered briefly, I covered the capital of New Jersey, and I knew nothing about their history. So I started trying to find a book about the early governors, and up cropped the name of William Franklin. And I didn't even know at that point that he was the son of Benjamin Franklin. So I actually applied for a grant from the American Philosophical Society to do just a chapter in a new book on the Loyalists, because the Loyalists had been not only neglected, but they were really a dirty word, so to speak, among American history buffs and scholars. My own father, who was quite an avid student of history and with a family in the Revolution, didn't want it very well known that he had family on both sides, and was very horrified when I started writing about the Loyalists and William Franklin. And actually, I wrote the first full-length book that included William Franklin, called A Little Revenge, Benjamin Franklin and His Son. What did I learn in that case, really? I learned the story of the Loyalists, and it was basically ignored. I mean, Jefferson and Adams buried their political hatchets when they were old men and wrote to each other. What really happened in the Revolution? It's getting all distorted. And it was Adams, in a rare moment of brevity, who responded, 1/3 of Americans wanted independence, 1/3 of Americans wanted to remain Englishmen, and the other third, it depended where the armies were. Well, by that logic, a third, and I think he was pretty accurate, were on the Loyalist side, the losing side. It was the largest out-migration in history at the end of the Revolution, when 5% of Americans left. You don't get that kind of refugee movement again until the partition of India. So the Loyalists were neglected, and what I learned was about the Loyalists. And I also learned from it that the greatest loss that Benjamin Franklin had when it was all over was not pecuniary. It was the loss of his son. They had been very, very close. His son became the leader of the Loyalists and was forced into exile, or he would have been hanged.
All right, well, thank you. Last two questions are sort of a similar nature, so I'm going to combine them. I'll give James Bissell of Missouri credit for submitting a question, but I think his question is kind of consumed in the previous one. So it appears that Parliament was waging economic warfare against the colonies for a long time before the split, with various acts, tariffs, and fees that they had imposed. The Navigation Acts, Currency Act, writs of assistance, to name just a few, seem designed to restrict initiative and make the colonies solely dependent upon England for their sustenance. What changed to make Parliament think the mutually beneficial policies that had grown for decades under the laissez-faire practice of salutary neglect were no longer working? And was tea simply the tipping point, or was the die already cast that we were going to sue for independence?
It's an excellent question. They both are combined to one. First of all, the Navigation Acts had been on the books for 100 years. They were just not enforced. They were impractical because, for one thing, the cost of collection would have been greater than the revenue that was derived. And the king's advisors before George III saw that. So laissez-faire was the practice. And then again, after the French and Indian War, which is what we call it, but it was even more expensive and catastrophic in Europe as the Seven Years' War. The English had to borrow heavily from the landowners, from investors, tax triple the value of their land before that war was over, again and again, taxed again and again. To hire German mercenaries, for one thing, to fight against the French. So England was broke. And so many of the British officers had been to the American colonies and were shocked to see people riding around in carriages with matched horses and liveried servants, or a house like Hancock's on Beacon Hill, or of Benny Wentworth's 54 rooms in his house, by far the biggest in New England. So there was a backlash in England, so that the people supported Parliament in increasing taxes. And you had an amateur government in the British monarchy. You didn't have really a very solid, even bureaucracy. You had a revolving door of 125 people who owned the British Empire. Of those, 25 were active on committees, and they just went from committee room to committee room, somewhat like our senators. Senators are much more experienced. And you wound up with Turnip Townsend, whose heart really was in manuring his fields, so that his turnips would grow and feed his livestock. You had a Scottish lord, Lord Bute, who couldn't get along with anybody, but he was used to being a Scottish lord. And the crowds turned over his carriage to get across from the lead. So they did not have an experienced government. They sat around in Parliament and debated, what do I do with an empire? And so you get the rise and fall of the Roman Empire being written by a member of Parliament who knew that nobody knew what to do and were drawing on the Romans, never minding their catastrophic decisions at the time. So you had bungling, you had envy, you had misunderstanding. And then it looked as if the Americans were taking advantage of the whole system. So Parliament began to peel back some of the advantages. The Stamp Act, we've never really understood how that impacted everybody. Every piece of paper for a newspaper had come on stamped paper from England. It was very expensive paper. You couldn't make your own paper. Franklin found somebody who could make paper, but until then he had to import it. If George Washington, at the end of a day in the fields, riding around his fields or hovering over his account books, wanted to go to his gaming table at Mount Vernon with a few friends and open a fresh pack of cards, the stamp tax was on the cards. The stamp tax on a deck of cards would have hired a farm manager for a month. If he then decided to roll the dice instead, the stamp tax on the package of dice would have bought him 2 horses. I mean, this is when George Washington began to put things together and say, this is unfair. We fought, we bled, we ran up terrific debts of our own. And who knew better than George Washington after 5 years of fighting on the frontier? So at that level, but everybody at the lowest possible, people on the frontier, et cetera, they had to import their tools. because you couldn't make iron. George Washington's father discovered and marketed iron, but he had to buy a rake for his field workers from England. Everything he couldn't have somebody make a hat because the law said that hats had to be made in England. We can't, shiploads of glass going back and forth, not going back and forth, going from England to America. Gradually, the crush of all these regulations, I think, led to the tipping point. And the tipping point was the Tea Party, yes, because Americans knew that the tea was coming the most expensive way from East India, and that the tea was owned and shipped, and the profit went to members of parliament individually because it cost £1,000 sterling. In other words, $150,000 our money for each share in the East India Company. And then the laws were changed, so the customs were waived or cut heavily on tea directly imported from Sri Lanka and India, where Americans had for many, many years just bought it from the Dutch in the Caribbean. But before these new laws, you were a merchant. And after the new laws, you were a smuggler, and you were being treated as a criminal by the Royal Navy and by the King's customs officers. So collectively, the whole thing amounted to blowing over at that tipping point, so to speak, in 1773 with the Boston Tea Party, which went against all the reasoning of the English, that we did not have the right to rebel, and we certainly didn't have the right to destroy the property of English Parliament members.
All right. Thank you, Willard. That was fascinating. I'd like to thank you for spending time with us today. This has been a wonderful interview, and I think people are going to get a lot out of this, filling in a lot of blanks in the background of what can be put into simple terms based on what we were taught growing up in elementary school, but which is a much more complex issue than most people assume it to be. But this is fascinating. I encourage everybody to go out and get a copy of The Founder's Fortunes. And we encourage you to visit Willard's website to learn more about his latest projects and to see more on his titles. The website is www.willardrandall.net.
It's been a great pleasure for me to get to talk to people who know so much about the Revolutionary period and are willing to learn more and to take into account a new research and new viewpoints. Our knowledge of that period and of its relevance today keeps growing and expanding. And it's my pleasure to have such a knowledgeable and interested audience. And thank you very much, Brooks. It's been a great pleasure as an interview.